I want to give my thanks to the organizers of this to invite me here. Are most of you law students? Some of us. Some of us, okay. I was supposed to talk about political repression in the legal system, and I will, but I think I like to put things in a historical context. I think that one of the things that we really should try to understand is that we are living in a historical moment. And this historical moment requires of us some degree of analysis, of introspection, and of self-realization, if you will. Earlier today, I was doing I did an interview. We were talking about things such as the Black Panther Party, the political repression of the Black Panther Party, etc. Many people have the idea and the notion that the Black Panther Party was a failure, that the Black Panther Party didn't succeed, and that it was, in many respects, and this comes from a lot of black academicians who were hating on the party because many of them were cultural nationalists in the 60s, and they were wearing their dashikis and afros, and they thought their dashikis were bulletproof. And so a lot of them have this perception of the Black Panther Party as gun-toting street Negroes, street blacks with guns, who had no political analysis and who had no understanding of what they were really doing. They were just hating on the police. And many of you who are young, who were not around in the 60s, probably have read much of that in the documentation that you've read on the Black Panther Party. But you need to ask yourself, how is it that an organization that only existed for 4 or 5 years, in actuality, was able to transcend generations, still remembered by people around the world, still inspiring people and students to study and stand up and struggle? Many students and many people that I have encountered hardly remember SNCC, Student Nonviolent Organization Committee, hardly remember SCLC, CORE, all vital organizations in the struggle of African people for human rights in this country. But they remember the Black Panther Party. Even though their memory or how its accounts of its history have been distorted, they remember that. And why is that? You need to ask yourself, why is that? And the reason is not because the Black Panther Party had an answer to everything, or that they were especially revolutionary, they were so dynamic as revolutionaries that the US government actually feared the overthrow by the Black Panther Party. That wasn't it at all. What was it? The United States of America in 1967, in 1968, in 1969, in 1970 was in a historical moment. And the Black Panther Party found themselves at the cutting edge of that historical moment. Now, what historical moment am I talking about here? In 1968, the United States was undergoing a period of civil tumult. In Islam, we call it fitna. The United States was facing urban rebellions throughout the nation every year. Hundreds of cities were going up in smoke. Black people were demonstrating for human rights and civil rights in the streets. The image of the United States abroad was the image of a hypocritical nation that talked about freedom and democracy and equality, but yet the world was treated to the images of dogs attacking peaceful demonstrators, police beating women and children in the streets. The image of the United States was at its all-time low. But at this particular point, the United States was still empire. It was still developing the consolidation of what we have today, or what I call the national security state. The national security state wasn't completed in 1969. The consolidation of the right wing in America and white supremacy in America had undergone and was undergoing a severe challenge. What was this challenge? This challenge was for human rights, was for human dignity, was anti-imperialist. The streets of America were filled with anti-war demonstrators, hundreds of thousands of them. Young children, much like yourselves, the children of white America, were fleeing the country, going to Canada to avoid the draft. there was an involuntary military draft in effect. The United States as an empire had an army that was constituted of draftees, conscripts. And it was fighting a war in Vietnam that was unpopular. And President Lyndon Baines Johnson at the time, in '68, right before the Tet Offensive, said that the United States was turning the corner in Vietnam. He had authorized sending 50,000 more troops to Vietnam that very year. And he had said that he had been promised by his military leaders and his military advisors that the United States was turning a corner in Vietnam and that the Viet Cong and the communists were defeated. We were seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But you heard the metaphor. The light at the end of the tunnel is what? Be careful. It's an oncoming train. So Lyndon Baines Johnson told the American people that we were winning the war in Vietnam. This is 1968. And lo and behold, by December of 1968, the Viet Cong, so-called Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese People's Army launched the Tet Offensive. And in hundreds of hamlets and towns and cities across Vietnam, the North and the Viet Cong took control. And this was transmitted into the living rooms of American people. They saw the Vietnamese in the U.S. Embassy in Saigon just weeks after Lyndon Baines Johnson had said that the war was won. It forced Walter Cronkite to issue his first statement condemning the war in Vietnam. Much like the media today in Iraq, in terms of Iraq and Iran, the media was a cheerleader of the Vietnam War. It encouraged the elites of America to wage this imperialist war. So '68, when the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, and the streets of America were filled with rebellious youth protesting the war, black people protesting second-class citizenship. In France and in Europe, the students were going on strike. In France, for instance, the students went on strike, and the French workers went out in sympathy with them in 1968. And it closed down the whole French Republic. It threatened the very existence of France as a republic. At the same time that this was happening in 1968, liberation movements in Africa were beginning to get support and aid from the United States Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union, and were beginning to show headway in the liberation struggles in Africa, defeating the imperialists almost at every turn. All of these events in 1968 came together to bring onto the world stage and onto the national stage Richard Milhous Nixon. Lyndon Baines Johnson, after the Tet Offensive, said he would not run for president again. And he stepped down, leaving the door open to the Republican Party and Richard M. Nixon. Now, Richard M. Nixon, of course, we all know, had a history of red baiting and anti-communism. But Richard M. Nixon was no fool. He was a consummate politician, and he knew that in 1969, in that period, 68, 69, and 70, that he had to gain control of social culture in the United States. Political control of culture, political control of society, legal control of its citizens. Now, we have to remember that in 1968, SWAT teams didn't exist. Did you know that? You always thought there were SWAT teams, right? SWAT teams didn't exist in 1968. In 1968, for instance, to give you an example, and this is very important to understand, you had major urban areas such as New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, New Orleans, that had some of the most corrupt police departments in the country. The New York City Police Department was one of the most corrupt police departments in America. As the Knapp Commission and the Serpico story would come out and prove. It was the Black Panther Party in New York City and in Chicago and in San Francisco that started organizing in the African community for community control of the police. Community control of the police. Not decentralization of the police, but community control. And community control meant that the people in the community would control the policies and the standards of the local police department. That they would impose a residency clause, that the police should come from the community that they worked in. Because most of the African communities were policed by white policemen who didn't live in the city, who didn't live in the community. They were an occupying army in the black community. And their sole purpose in the black community was not to defend African people from criminal activity, but to impose the status quo's will on people of African ancestry, to brutalize them, to murder them in the name of the law. You have to remember that to this very day, the United States does not admit to having political prisoners. To this very day, 20 or so years after COINTELPRO, America has no political prisoners. But I'm going to come to that for the benefit of our law students. But for the benefit of those who are a little more eclectic in their studies, I want to point out to you that this period of time, 68, 69, 70, marked a crucial period in America's transition from a bourgeois democracy to democratic fascism that we have today. So when Richard Nixon came into power, he saw all of this turmoil and tumult in America, and he says, well, we got to get control. Lacking a national police force, what was he to do? The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was conducting a covert program called the Counterintelligence Program that initially started, its first practices were initially carried out against Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the head of the United Negro Improvement Association. Now, without going into the history of the UNIA and Garvey, suffice it to say that the techniques of the counterintelligence program that were to be developed in the 50s against the Communist Party, and it was used against black nationalists before World War I and after World War I and in between the wars, these techniques were first used and utilized on the plantations in the United States. Simple techniques, hanging people from trees, death of 1,000 cuts, waterboarding. Y'all just heard of that. Crackers used to do that to Africans on the plantation on a regular basis. It's nothing new. These techniques all existed. These techniques of torture, divide and conquer, internalization of hatred to the point of self-hatred. All of these techniques, more than 2 Negroes in one place at a time constituted the conspiracy. The only time Africans were allowed to get together were in church on Sundays or at, Catfish Row on Sundays. And who they had to listen to? They had to listen to the minister. And you know how that turned out. We wound up with Jesse today. We're still listening to ministers. But having said that, these techniques of the counterintelligence program, divide and conquer, misinformation, defamation of character, arrest and coercion, physical violence, intimidation, terrorism, were all techniques that were employed in the antebellum South. But they developed and changed as America developed and changed. And by the 1960s, 1950s, America was undergoing a process of urbanization and the development of a global technological infrastructure. These developments, urbanization of America, the war in Vietnam, the migratory patterns of American working people, the struggles of African people for human rights, the struggles of women for their rights, the anti-war sentiments in the country, all constituted a nation about to explode. So when Richard Nixon ran for office, he ran on the ticket that he represented who? The silent majority. They weren't in the streets demonstrating. They weren't protesting the war. They weren't demanding better working wages. They weren't doing none of these things. They were the silent, suffering majority. You know, the same ones that Sarah Palin calls the real Americans. Same crew. I used to say back then, the silent majority. Every time I drove past the cemetery, I said, there's Nixon's silent majority. But he ran on this ticket of he was representing the American people. He was representing the people who didn't have a voice, who weren't out in the street demonstrating, who were hard-working people. Middle America. You know, Pabst Blue Ribbon, redneck, White Sox. Red, white, and blue. He represented them. But his problem was he didn't have a national police force to repress all of this protest and all of this movement. And you remember, those of you who've seen all the movies and stuff about the counterculture, you know about the hippie movement, right? You know about the counterculture, the Timothy Leary version of history, you know, tune in, tune out, you know, turn on, tune out. 1967 was the summer of love. Demonstrators were sticking flowers down National Guard barrels and, you know, gun barrels. This was the summer of love. This was a period where counterculture was beginning to supplant the mainstream culture, especially amongst the youth. And a consequence of this, of course, was that young whites began to interact more with black people on a very fundamental level. You know, like smoking weed together, freaking out at concerts, listening to Jimi Hendrix bug out and play the guitar backwards, you know, jumping up and down like a puppet, you know, to the Doors, you know. Even John Lee Hooker had to come back. All the old blues musicians, Rolling Stones, were paying tribute to old blues. This was an era in which blacks and the culture of, quote, the counterculture began to come together. So Nixon was very shrewd. He said, well, we can't have this. This is getting out of control. So he ran on the ticket of representing the silent majority. He launched the war on drugs. He established an alliance with the Mexican government and began to spray the marijuana crops with pacuay, which was a form of Agent Orange. He sprayed the marijuana crops with pacuay, the Agent Orange, and people started smoking that stuff when it came across the border and bugged out. But the war on drugs was Nixon's initiative. And what was the purpose of the war on drugs? To consolidate law enforcement, to politicize law enforcement, to give law enforcement the opportunity to acquire military skills for domestic repression under the guise of curtailing the importation of legal drugs. So he launched the war on drugs as soon as he came into office, and he established the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEA, L-E-A-A. And LEA was designed to provide federal funding to local police agencies. If you had 2 black people in town, you qualified for anti-riot government subsidies. Didn't make a difference whether the 2 black people in town were 2 professors or not. You were qualified for federal funding to prepare your police department to deal with racial unrest. This was the purpose of the Law Enforcement Assistance Association. And it was out of this particular program that the SWAT team training, the relationship between the military and domestic police became regularized and institutionalized. It was out of the law enforcement, out of the LEA mandate that FEMA was formed. You all know about FEMA. I mean, all we have to do is just reflect back on Katrina and we know about FEMA. But did we know that the Timothy McVeighs and the so-called right-wing All-Americans who support the Sarah Palins and the John McCains were all in state militias, began to become politicized in state militias that were given charters under the LEAA administration, under FEMA. State militias were supposed to be first responders in natural catastrophes. That was the, the facade that was put up. But who joined these state militias? Ex-Ku Klux Klansmen, Minutemen, right-wing John Birch Society types, ex-cops, military people, they all joined these militias. But remember, these militias were supposed to be for civil response to natural disaster. So under the pretext of providing government services for natural disasters, the Nixon administration put in motion the development of a police state in America. These were the kernels of the police state that we now see in America today. And you know what held up that development for 10 years? What do you think held up that development until 9/11? What do you think held up that development until 9/11? What do you think changed Nixon's plans? Forced them to modify his plans, delay much of them, and abandon some of their objectives. What do you think forced them to do that? In one word or in 3 words? Organizations like the Black Panther Party. So you see, the Black Panther Party was eminently successful in its 4 or 5 years of existence. Its success lay in the fact that it delayed, if not postponed, the consolidation of fascism in the United States for at least 10 years. It was necessary for the government then to devise a new strategy to consolidate police power in the United States and to take away the civil rights of people in this country. As the national security state began to develop, and this is the same state that Eisenhower warned us of when he was leaving office in the 1950s. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Any of you here familiar with Dwight D. Eisenhower? No? Yes? No? Because you know, you got a young audience, you got to break stuff down for them. They think I'm talking about something that happened 100 years ago. This happened when I was your age. You see? You thought, yeah, you thought it was some ancient history, right? Don't say that. It's not. I'm not that ancient. But this is recent history, and it's very important. You know, Dwight Eisenhower was the president of the United States. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with his track record, he was also the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. He's the one, amongst many generals, that led the United States effort against Nazi Germany in World War II. He was the supreme commander. And he went on to a political career and became president of the United States. And as he was leaving the office of presidency, as a military man, he advised the American people to beware of the military-industrial complex, because this particular entity was the most threatening entity to your human and civil rights, the military-industrial complex. You know, and then he faded on into history. But he was right. What was developing in the 1950s during the Cold War, and you got to remember what the Cold War was. The Cold War was finance capitalism's attempt to deprive you of the resources necessary to change America. Trillions of dollars were spent in the Cold War, preparing for what? For a confrontation that never took place. Preparing for nuclear war. The United States spent trillions of dollars developing a nuclear arsenal that it would never use. Soviet Union likewise. The Cold War was a false dichotomy in the sense that the protagonists in the Cold War never fought each other, never fired a shot at each other. They fought the wars in the Congo. They fought for territory and power in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, in the Congo, in Somalia, in the Sudan, in the Middle East. But they never fired a shot at each other. And so they spent trillions of dollars terrifying Americans into believing that the Russian bear was just over the horizon and was about to attack America. And that if we had to be strong and we had to defend ourselves against this threat. I grew up in the Cold War. I was in junior high school and public school during the Cold War. And I remember when we used to hide under the desk during the fire drills. You know, if you have a fire drill here, what do? You orderly leave the building, right? You have to orderly leave the building, go outside, and stand in a place designated during a fire drill, right? Back then, that's not what happened. When the bell rang, you got under your desk because the Russians was coming. Serious. You remember you don't remember these old flip-up desks? They used to have the part used to flip up where you could put your books in. Y'all don't remember. See, y'all got all this slick stuff, and I don't remember none of that stuff. But I remember it. And we used to get under the desk until the all clear signal sounded. When all clear signal sounded, we came out. This false dichotomy, this Cold War, siphoned off trillions of dollars that could have went to develop America's infrastructure, that could have changed forever the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the United States. It went for what? To the military, to the corporations that supplied the military with the technology they needed to maintain their supremacy and hegemony in the world. The Cold War. Trillions of dollars down the drain. And then all of a sudden, after Ronald Reagan, 2 terms in office, the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union collapses, and now America is supreme. #1 power in the world. And the American elite, their brain trusts and their think tanks write out this grandiose scheme of America in the 21st century. I don't know how many of you read it, but you need to go read it. The 21st, America in the 21st century. And it talks about the United States military power and its supremacy, and how this is unprecedented in the history of the world. Never before has there been such a thing. I remember Rome. I remember Babylon. We remember a lot of things, don't we? There's never been an empire on this planet that did not come and go. But the most important thing to understand is the process of empire. How does a nation develop into an imperial empire? How did the United States develop into an imperial empire? Of course, I'm willing to come back if the history professors invite me back to talk about this, and I'm quite sure I would provide you with some insights that you really didn't think about. But right now, I'm focused on law students and their belief that somehow their career is going to effectuate change in this country. And I want to talk about that because what developed from Richard M. Nixon's campaign to politicize the police departments, to create an atmosphere that would be conducive to the American people submitting to a police state, was very ingenious, and it took a period of time, but it worked. It worked. And what Richard M. Nixon did, despite the fact that, he was hounded out of office, what he did was he created the foundation for what the Patriot Act would consolidate. Because in the Nixon administrations came up with the Omnibus Crime and Safe Street Act, which was an equivalent, a domestic version, sort of equivalent of the Patriot Act. Every time that the United States empire is in crisis, and it has to institute laws that the people know are against their better interests, it creates a terrorist persona, a threat from the outside, and then it passes legislation to address that threat. During the 50s in the Cold War, it was the McCarran Act. And the McCarran Act led to the House on Un-American Activities establishing a permanent committee. And you had to come before this committee, you were often summoned to this committee to declare your patriotism. I am not a communist. I believe in the United States of America and all of its stands, and I'm not a communist. Everybody had to come in front of McCarthy and the politicians that sat on the House on American Activities and explained themselves. People were purged from their jobs. People were stigmatized. Whole careers were ruined. The McCarran Act. So when Nixon came into office, he had to have his act too. What was it going to be, the Nixon Act? No. It was the Omnibus Crime and Safe Streets Act. Because remember what he said. He represented the silent majority. And who was in the streets? Protesters, black civil rights demonstrators, militants. They were all in the streets. So he forced through, the Republican Party, with their majority at that time, forced through the Omnibus Crime and Safe Streets Act. And it was out of this act that a whole plethora of other institutions evolved, many of them we know today in different names. So Richard Nixon was very important and pivotal in creating the atmosphere and the basis for what was to come next. And what came next? After the Cold War was over, and the Russian bear was no longer the boogeyman, we turned our attention to what? Who became the pariah of world peace and security? What became the major force against imperialism? Was it Marxism, Leninism? We know that by the late 1960s, most of Africa was already independent. By 1973, they all were, except for maybe one or two provinces, because you know the Portuguese are stubborn and they held on to the last moment. But basically, Africa was liberated. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown. So the idea of Pan-African unity and the development of an African continent that was unified went the way of separate elites. To this very day, you have 53 African nations, and not one of them is a genuine African nation. Not one. They were all beholding to clones of, imitations of European nation states. So we have come to a point in history when Richard M. Nixon ascended to power in the United States, where the United States was at a crucial turning point. It could move in either direction. It could move towards enlightenment and liberal change, empowering its people, providing for their people. Universal health care was possible in 1969. Because people had a better understanding of what socialism was and what it wasn't then. Now you ask the average American what is socialism, and they'll tell you Barack Obama. Barack Obama is a socialist. Y'all didn't know that, right? Y'all didn't know it. He's an undercover socialist. He's the only socialist that was financed by every major financial institution in the country. In his campaign, he raised more money than any other presidential candidate in history. History. He raised more money than Ronald Reagan and all of them combined. He was able to do that as an outsider. You know, he was basically an outsider. Nobody supported him. But he raised all this money. I know it all came from our piggy banks, right? Millions and millions of dollars came from our nickels and dimes that we contribute to the Obama dream. Yes, we can. Here's my dime. I'm down. Give me the Kool-Aid. So, Richard M. Nixon in 1968 and 1969 created the foundation that would go on to develop. You know, we had the brief episode of the peanut farmer and Jimmy Carter. You know, because after all of these excesses of an administration, there always comes in a liberal regime that vows to change everything. And that's what Jimmy Carter was supposed to do. He came in vowing to change everything. He even appointed, what's his name? Somebody give me some help here. You know, I can't remember all these Negroes' names. You know, they just... Andrew Young, my man, Andy. He appointed Andy Young as the United States representative to the United Nations, and Andy thought he was really the United Nations representative to the UN, and he started talking to the Arabs. He started talking to the Palestinians. Yo, you know, we could work this out. The Zionist lobby went bananas. They went crazy. To the point where Jimmy Carter had to fire Andrew Young. Said he had no authorization to talk to the PLO and to Yasser Arafat and his organization. Of course, we know today that the United States does what? Talk to the PLO. In fact, they tell you the PLO is an integral part of the peace process. In fact, they are training the PLO security forces in order to keep in check who? Hamas. But we're coming to that in a moment. My point is, Richard Nixon, got to give Tricky Dick his due. Despite his shortcomings, despite his personal paranoia and insecurities, he laid the foundation for the modern police state that we are experiencing today and that we call democracy. The police departments of America were politicized during this period. Police associations became an integral part of the Republican and right-wing agenda. Their representation became important and essential. So by the time that Jimmy Carter came out of office and Ronald Reagan was elected to his first term, the great communicator had something to work with. He had something to work with. And it was Ronald Reagan's policies, domestic and foreign, that began to transform the gains that Richard Nixon had made, political gains on the right, into a movement and consolidated right wing. That would ensure his power for at least 8 years and would hound Bill Clinton for another 8 until we got George Bush the first. Then George Bush the second. This is getting boring, right? So where do we get these guys from? You know? And today the peanut farmer is what? The foremost advocate of Palestinian liberation. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter talks about Israeli apartheid. He visits the West, the Gaza Strip. He has a more cogent analysis of the situation in that part of the world than any of the people currently in office, including Barack Obama himself. This is Jimmy Carter, the same one that fired Andrew Young for talking to the Arabs. How come he wasn't like that when he was president? You notice how all these presidents, when they get out of office, they get militant. They get progressive. But when they was in office, they was quiet as church mice. You couldn't hear a minute of protest. You look at your homeboy Barack. I know I shouldn't deal with him, right? I really should bypass him. But I can't bypass him completely because you have to understand that Barack Obama is the man of the historical moment. He was chosen. He was trained. He was groomed. Now, if you think I'm talking about some Illuminati or Society of the Skulls sitting in some room with ancient Roman symbolism saying, we're going to pick Barack Obama to represent imperialism and finance capital, so it shall be done. It wasn't that simple. I'm not an advocate of conspiracy theories. I just want you to know that up front. I believe it is what it is. I believe people can analyze and see things for what they are. I don't believe there was a group of men sitting around somewhere. It has to be men because we know about power and misogyny. That there's a group of men sitting around, have sat around for the last 500 years determining which way Western civilization goes. And that's the way Western civilization has went in lockstep. It's not that happened. That's not happening. That's not what happened. History does create men and women, but men and women make history. And we are in a historical moment. And I'm repeating this over and over again because you must make history. You have to change the course of fascism in this country. You have to make this world a better place. And you are living in a historical moment where you have to do that now because you have no other choice. So getting back to homeboy, the great communicator, he comes into office, and what is the first thing that he begins to do? He begins to propound a philosophy of capitalism that we've come to know as trickle-down prosperity. He begins to consolidate even more the power of the military-industrial complex. What is Ronald Reagan credited for? For building a strong U.S. military, right? A robust presence of America in the world. Here we have a nation, your nation, with 170 plus military bases around the world. Yet if you ask anybody in the administration from Obama on down, is the United States an imperial power? They'll tell you no. We're not an imperial power. So why you have 173 bases in 85 different countries and you ain't got nothing to do with imperialism? I mean, what's up with that? Well, the United States has interests. Last I heard, that was part of imperialism. National interests. Well, the United States has national interests. And its allies have national interests. Who are the allies of the United States? Do you want me to get specific? Britain, Canada, Australia. You know, Germany, most of the time, after World War II, all the time. The French, ain't happening. Nepal. glory was France. France used to be the beacon of Western civilization. And you've been to Paris, you know how arrogant the French are. Especially people of color. If you've been there, you know how arrogant. You got to cuss them out, slap them upside the face. That's the only way they start respecting you. They don't respect nobody else. So they have this cultural thing where they'll get down with the Americans and the British and the Canadians. But what I'm trying to point out is, with the exception of Germany after World War II, all of the wars and all of the battles that the United States has fought internationally has been in an alliance with other English-speaking colonies from Britain. English-speaking. You speak English? Speaking English? Yes, English-speaking countries. The United States has always marched lockstep with the manifest destiny of Great Britain. So it's not a coincidence, and you need to analyze that aspect of history, because it's very important in understanding where we're at right now and how it is that the coalition of the willing is who? In Iraq. Britain, who else? Canada, who else? Australia. You know, New Zealand's in there too, you know. But they're like a little junior partner, you know. Was the French in the coalition of the willing? Not overtly. The intelligence agencies were involved. Were the Germans in the coalition of the willing? Yes, but they only provided medical personnel, no combat people. Ever since the Germans got their ass whipped in World War II, they've been down with America since then. It's like the bully in the schoolyard. After he beat your butt, you always is yes man. Yeah, that's right, tell him, Joe. Because he done whipped that butt so long ago, you know where the side of power lies. That's how the Germans are. You see? My point is that the geopolitics that we are beginning to experience today had their auspices in this period. And even before then, in the founding of the colonies and the liberation struggles that the colonies waged against their colonial homelands. The English-speaking people, you know, my wife asked me, she said she has a new professor, you know, at her, and you know, she's doing her courses and stuff. She has a new professor, and this new professor said that his major distinction, and this is a vignette, you know, I know I'm digressing, but here's a point to this. She has this new professor, and this professor told her that he's convening the class. He told her, well, you know, my major claim, I want y'all to know who I am. And he says, my major claim to fame, my major experiences, the two most important experiences in my life is I was struck by lightning. I was in a house that was struck by lightning twice. And I am an authority on terrorism for the CIA. I'm a consultant to the CIA on terrorism. So I said to her, why don't you ask this guy, what does one do to be a consultant on terrorism? How does one advise the U.S. government? What do? You read books on terrorism? You go to the library, you Google terrorism, and then you research that? How do you deal with that? Do you go and join a terrorist cell and talk to the individuals who are involved in it, or do you get involved in the movement so you could, how does one become an expert on terrorism? Because you got a lot of white boys that are experts on everything. That's how we got into this recession. They're experts on this stuff. You remember Gold, what is it? What's his name? Goldspan? Greenspan. I'm getting him mixed up with somebody. Remember Greenspan when he was asked, did he anticipate this reception? You remember, did y'all see that? Y'all didn't see it on television. You got to go to YouTube or something and see this. Homeboy, now you got to remember, for over a decade, this man was considered the guru of finance capitalism. He was like everybody hung on his every word. It's like, so Mr. Goldspan, what do you think the economy will do in the next year? They were hanging on his words. So when they asked him, did you see this coming? Goldspan said, to be honest with you, I didn't have a clue. You got to see this guy say this. This guy said, I never thought or considered things happening this way. I felt, we could control this and we could control that and we could regulate this. But this, I got to admit, I never saw it coming. So, for those of you in law school who are told you have to learn the history of the writ of mandamus and the writ of habeas corpus and where it comes from, and the great Magna Carta and how it was a tribute to humanity and it was a curtailment of the arbitrary whim of nobility and all of that crap that you all was told, you know. Think again. It was written by people like Greenspan, who was clueless. Who were clueless. When you are in a historical moment, very seldom do you understand the moment that you're in. That's why we're having this meeting here. That's why we're here. It's very difficult to be in a situation like we are in and understand the forces that are at work against us. It's very, very difficult. That's why people make history, but history also makes people. Think of what would have happened if if the Germans invaded the Soviet Union and Stalin wasn't the dictator. Who do you think would have won? There was only one person to his right that was more ruthless than him, and that was Joseph Stalin. And he's the one that saved the Soviet Union, whether you like it or not. If he was absent from the historical moment, me and you might be speaking German. Because if you remember, one battle on the Russian front equaled the entire force that was fielded on the Western Front. The Battle of Kursk alone in the Soviet Union in 1943 had over 1.7 million soldiers on one side and 1.3 million on the other side. That's almost 3 million soldiers in one battle. Over 1,200 tanks on one side and 1,000 plus on the other. One battle. When you look at the Normandy invasion included less than 150,000 men initially. My point is that the great expenditure of resources and military power was used on the Russian front. If the Russian front didn't exist, the United States wouldn't have won the war. Or at least it wouldn't have won it in that fashion. So we need to ask ourselves, if you remove a person from history, what happens? It's a very important question. What happens? So you see that Obama, and my point is that the president that we have today, a black president, and you know, you have people crying and rolling around. Black folks was like ecstatic when the homeboy was elected. It's like, yes, we finally arrived. You know? Race is dead. The issue of race is dead. Americans, you know, George Will. I don't know if any of you are familiar with George Will. George Will is a right-wing political pundit who said upon the election of Barack Obama that his election was white people's emancipation. Was white Americans' emancipation, and it's true. White folks finally got rid of the onerous mantle of white supremacy because they elected a black president. They were no longer, you know, racist. You can't say that America's racist because they elected a black president. Well, I beg to differ. First of all, Obama is not the type of black person that white folks really are afraid of. Maybe Michelle's ancestors are, but not Barack. Barack doesn't have any bullwhip days in his background. His ancestors weren't on the plantation getting lashed and waterboarded. His father came from Kenya. He was raised in Hawaii by white parents and went to Harvard Law School. How many black folks you know in Harvard graduated from Harvard Law School? And it was president of the Harvard Law Review at that. Obviously, homeboy is a gifted, intelligent, and very articulate individual. But hey, man, so was Adolf Hitler. He was gifted, intelligent, and a very articulate individual. I mean, he led the whole German people to perdition. You can't get no more rhetorically effective than that when you lead people. I mean, that's like Jim Jones. So we need to understand that Barack Obama, and you know, I had this politician, this black politician the other day tell me, well, America, the reason why whites voted for Barack Obama in such large numbers was because they were tired of George Bush. And that their world around them was collapsing. You know, Fannie Mae went belly up. You know, mortgages were going up. People were not having jobs. And, you know, So white Americans were suffering, like we all were suffering. We were all feeling this pressure. So Barack comes along with a message of change, and white folks said, well, we really don't know. This guy is black. So let's give him the litmus test. What's your relationship to Farrakhan? Please, you know I'm not down with Farrakhan. Okay, you was in this church with Reverend Wright, and this guy talked about goddamn America. Do you say that? Well, I can no more denounce Reverend Wright or deny Reverend Wright than I can black people, but I'm not limited by them. Next question. Oh, well, he's cool. He's not a black nationalist. He's not an undercover black Muslim. You understand? So he's cool. He passed the litmus test. Now, of course, if he would have said, well, I've been in this church of Reverend Wright's for years. My children have been in this church for years. And I think this is a moment when America should reflect on its history and white supremacy and racism and understand what Reverend Wright is saying. I challenge, academia, white academia, to come and debate this issue about racism and what he is saying is true or not. He didn't say that. He said, homeboy, I ain't with that. You on your own. Me, I'm just trying to get elected. So Obama, just like Stalin, and I'm not saying that he has the same ideology or he is a dictator like Stalin. Let's not get this twisted here. I'm not comparing Obama to Hitler or Stalin, because I know some of you will go away and write that. Bill Wahad came to Minneapolis and said that Obama was the same as Adolf Hitler. You think I'm joking? People would say that. And you're sitting here listening to me. Am I saying that? Am I saying that they are the same? I'm saying that the historical movement calls into existence the personalities and individuals that can take history to another level. That's what I'm saying. And be it villain or hero or shero, that historical movement does not discriminate. And so white America did not vote for Obama because he was black. They voted for Obama because he represented the American dream. Dreams of my father, not nightmares of my ancestors. You see? He wasn't going to wake up in the White House with a historical moment and say, man, these are the same people that murdered and killed my ancestors. Let me call the First Air Force in and have them bomb the capital of Alabama. He wasn't going to get a flashback like that because it wasn't in his DNA. So white folks knew that what they were voting for was dreams of my father. Such a wonderful story. I mean, Hallmark, Disney could tell this story. It's a beautiful story. Father in the village in Kenya, and I could hear the music. And there's this father, dreaming and wanting to be great. But his father used to be a member of the Mau Mau. You didn't know that part, did you? His father was a supporter of the Mau Mau. You know who the Mau Mau were in Kenya? The Mau Maus had a philosophy, I guess this will sum it up: one settler, one bullet. The Mau Mau was the liberation movement of Kenya against the British occupation, against British colonialism. And most of the Mau Mau leaders, including Jomo Kenyatta, who would come to be president of Kenya, were thrown into jail by the British. So Obama's father was a pretty radical dude in Kenya. But then again I said he was raised where he was raised. His past, his history is what it is. And Dreams of My Father inspired white folks to transcend their fear of black people. Because here was the penultimate American story. I mean, you read the book, tears all in your eyes, you start saying, oh man, this is wonderful. He overcame all of these things. I mean, he went to Harvard Law School. He went to Chicago. He became an activist. He could have been a member of any corporation. He could have been a corporate lawyer. If he'd have been a corporate lawyer, he would have never been president. We wouldn't be having this discussion. He went to Chicago to get trained by some of the baddest men in black politics. If you don't think that we've had some of the most heinous shysters in black politics to come out of Chicago, think again. Don't start me to naming names because I don't want to talk about Jesse and all of them. But Chicago has been a hotbed of black opportunism and black political misleadership. So he went there and got trained, and to his benefit, he did what he did. My point is that this is a man of the moment. Jimmy Carter was a man of the moment. Ronald Reagan was a man of the historical moment. Richard M. Nixon was a man of the moment. So don't think that the situation we are in today is beyond you being the person of the moment, because it's not. Some of you sitting over there who are in law school might one day be the Attorney General of the United States. Then what? You're going to be like Shawcroft or whatever that knucklehead's name was? Then what? You're going to say, I'm the Attorney General. What are you going to say? What type of laws are you going to say? Well, I heard a lecture about Dhoruba bin Wahad when I was in law school, and I ain't going to never, ever do anything but become a prosecutor. Because we got to keep Negroes like that in check. Because he's obviously crazy. White people very seldom confront white supremacy and racism and white skin privilege, just as men very seldom confront male privilege. How many men you know in here will confront male privilege without women getting in their butt? Not too many. Because you know how homeboys get when they get together, man. I'm telling you, man, them women, man, they should be on. That's how they do. I'm telling you, I know. You know, the last time I looked, I was a man, so I know. And so, you know, without that pressure, ain't nobody going to really fess up to anything, man. You know, because nobody wants to be embarrassed. Nobody wants to feel like they're oppressing other people. Nobody wants to feel like they're unjust. This is just human. Nobody wants to be, I mean, some people maybe, but most people want to try to at least appear fair. Right? So, no one's going to lay claim to this. But Homeboy said that, you know, I'm presenting this message of irreconcilable differences. And he felt that we should be able to go inside of the institutions and change them from within. I said, well, good luck to that. Because I have not known one institution in America that was changed from within. Do you know one? Where have all the reforms that we are talking about came from? They came from without. They came from people like you taking to the streets and making sure that these principles were upheld. In Islam, it's said to the Muslims, and this is a prerequisite to the Muslims. In Islam, in the Quran, it's said to the Muslims, O ye who believe, let there arise from amongst you a band of believers who will enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. Enjoin what's right and forbid the wrong. Who will arise from amongst these law students who will enjoin justice and forbid injustice? Maybe the person that should be giving this lecture is a very good friend of mine, Robert Boyle, who's an attorney at law in New York State. And he's the individual that got me out of prison. Him and Liz Fink, a Jewish woman with weight issues. And a mighty fighter in the courtroom. A mighty woman in the courtroom. These are people who fought for me for 10 years without a penny. Why? Because they believed in justice. And they fought for justice. Not for opportunity, not for career advancement, but for justice. And I hate to use cliches, but as long as America denies justice to people of color and to people who are oppressed, there will be no peace. America will have to wage war forever. And, you know, it's very hard for an imperial entity with 170 plus bases around the world to do that with a volunteer army. And the volunteer army came into existence when? At the end of the 60s. As a result of what? Protests in the streets. When the 1954 Supreme Court decision was passed, in Brown versus the Board of Education, did white folks run into the streets talking about hallelujah? They resisted every step of the way to integration of schools. They devised every means and mechanism to avoid it. And then when they finally couldn't get around it, they had to agree to it. And then they start talking about funding for private schools. When the laws in the United States that weren't on the books, when there weren't any laws on the books to govern how migrant workers were being treated in the Southwest, it was Cesar Chavez and the movements of migrant workers who changed that. It was changed from without. When women in this country didn't have the right to vote, it was women who took to the streets, a suffrage movement. Look at the films that changed that. None of these changes came from within the institutions. None of these changes came from within. They all were forced from without. So this historical moment belongs to you. It belongs to all of those people who are part and parcel of the globalization movement, who understand what New Age imperialism really represents. It's up to them. It's up to the anarchists that's throwing bricks through the Gucci display windows. It's up to them to be the rage in the machine, to be the cutting edge against this, to the point where now you have no freedom of speech. Do you know that? If they were to convene today in this city a convention to institutionalize war or to sanction war, another war, and you decided to come out and demonstrate against it, what would they do to you? They would tell you the demonstration, the free speech area is 1 mile from the venue. We'll have the cameras there, you can do your interviews there, we'll give you wireless networks access, and that's where you hold your demonstration, and the conference will be over here. And the people that you're demonstrating against won't hear nothing. Quite different than the Chicago riots during the Democratic Convention. Remember Chicago? They smelt the tear gas in the hotel. They had to go into their rooms with their handkerchiefs up because they smelt the tear gas. That's what the anarchists bring. They bring on the noise. Without noise, there's no music. What's the difference between noise and music? You ever thought about that? What's the difference between noise and music? Noise disturbs you. Music soothes and inspires you. That's the difference. So bring on the noise and disturb these bastards. They need to be disturbed. And those that are in the legal profession that want to pursue a career in legality, you should really research the auspices of these laws that we're talking about. Because you're not going to get it in law school. Have you heard about the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration from your law professor? Have you heard about it? Did he ever tell you about it? Did he ever tell you how the RICO Act came into existence? The Omnibus Crime and Safe Streets Act, how RICO evolved? It was evolved to do what? To fight the mafia and organized crime. That's what they tell you, right? But go look it up. Go ask your professor these questions. Say, I'm very interested in understanding the basis of RICO conspiracy theory. You know, a conspiracy theory that says if I know you and you know her and she commits a crime, I'm guilty. That's deep. I'm guilty, you guilty, and she's guilty. And actually, there's no degree in difference in the guilt. It's like the accomplice in an armed robbery. You know, in an armed robbery, the accomplice is almost as, if a murder is committed in an armed robbery, you get a murder charge, even if you didn't pull the trigger. You see? Of course, that doesn't apply to people like George Bush because he could murder millions of people and get away with it. But that's a whole different issue. My point is that you have to transform your career into something that's historically meaningful in the moment. And when I say historical moment, I don't mean the last 2 years or 5 years. It could last your lifetime. You know, Rome didn't collapse in a day. And America is sure not going to collapse in an hour. It's a process. It speeds up, it slows down, it moves here, it moves there. But it's a process. And it's very important for us to understand this process, how it's working on us, how it works. How do we begin to gather information in the age of information that's relevant? We have so much information today, it's information overload. There's this glut of information, and Huey P. Newton said that information is intelligence. That power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired fashion. Power is the ability to define reality and make that reality act in your behalf. That's what power is. That's why lawyers are always shot right after the revolution. Because their job is to define reality. That's their job. So the first thing you do is you shoot the lawyers that define the other reality and you put your lawyers in to define the new reality. I know it sounds cynical. I don't mean to be cynical. I mean to be truthful. And that's the bottom line. Lawyers exist to define the social writ, to research and define the social writ, to practice those definitions of the social writ in civil and criminal proceedings. And it's very difficult for you in this day and age to be in a profession that has sanctioned waterboarding, that has sanctioned torture, that has sanctioned imperialism, that has sanctioned military adventures abroad, that has sanctioned murder of innocent civilians. It's very difficult to be in a profession that has done that. And at the same time, deal with a nation and a government that is critical of irregulars who do the same thing. You know, ever since the bombing of Dresden in, I believe, 1944, civilians were no longer innocent. Civilians were legitimate military targets because civilians made the war effort possible. They supported the troops morally, ethically, spiritually, and financially and economically. They were the ones that populated the factories, that made the guns, that killed the enemy. So civilians became a legitimate target by the leaders and the allies in World War II. And from that point on, the idea and the notion of terrorism as something other than a tactic of war is absurd. How is there a war on a tactic? What is a war on terrorism? That's like declaring a war on amphibious invasions. Terrorism is a tactic that is used and has been used by both states and non-state entities almost since the beginning of time. So how do you declare a war on it? You declare a war on it when your country is in crisis, when your empire is in crisis, and you have to consolidate the type of power that would deprive them of their civil liberties. That's why today, democratic fascism, the national security state, sees all of you as potential terrorists. Not potential contributors to society, not as individuals that can make life better for people, but as potential terrorists. We're taught, if you see anything suspicious or you hear anyone saying anything, report it to the local officials. That's what they used to do in Nazi Germany, remember? Have you read about Nazi Germany? What did the Nazis do? They had children snitching on their parents, brothers snitching on their sisters, sisters snitching on their mothers. Anyone that was critical of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and you said anything in public, or you said something around an unguarded moment, you would disappear. Now, the last time I heard the word disappear used in America, it was in conjunction with rendition. That disappeared. In the United States today, under Obama, is still running rendition camps in Kenya, in East Africa, in Eastern Europe. They're still running these camps. Right here in the United States, you have a Guantanamo in Colorado. You have almost all of the political prisoners that are in federal custody in Colorado. Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H. Rap Brown. 23-hour lockdown in Colorado. One visit a month, one phone call a month. That sounds like Guantanamo to me. Same thing. How much time or recreation do they get out there selling Guantanamo? 1 hour. How many phone calls are they allowed to make? Zip. How many legal visits are they permitted a month? Zip. Who are they? Who are these people in Guantanamo who have fallen between the ideals of the Magna Carta in the U.S. Constitution? Who are they? These people who have somehow are outside of the purview of the Geneva Convention and the Convention on Human Rights. Who are they? Who are these people that don't deserve any justice? Who are they? What crimes have they committed to put them in this situation? What crimes have they committed? They are defined as what? Illegal combatants. Isn't that the term that's used? Illegal enemy combatants, right? Oh, what category? Have anybody seen that category in the Geneva Convention? It's something that an attorney made whole cloth to justify what George Bush did. Now, what are the principles of Nuremberg? That those who facilitate genocide, that those who write about genocide to justify it, that those who contribute to the rulers carrying out genocidal policies are equally as guilty as those who carried out the genocide. That's the basis, that was the principles in the Nuremberg trial. You couldn't get away being the minister of propaganda and said you didn't have nothing to do with the extermination of gypsies and Roma people and Jews and people and communists. You couldn't say that. I ain't had nothing to do with it. I just wrote the parameters of discipline. I just wrote the legal parameters for Auschwitz concentration camp. I wasn't running the camp. I had nothing to do with Dachau. That didn't work in Nuremberg. Was that an argument that was accepted in Nuremberg? No. Why do we accept that argument today? Why is it applicable to people like you who worked under the Bush administration, who justified and rationalized torture? How is it possible for the Obama administration to come into power and say that we're not going to pursue the violators of these laws when they have in their prisons political prisoners who've been in jail for 30 years? 30 years. Many of you aren't even 30 years old in here. These brothers and sisters went to prison before you were born. But there is no reconciliation around that. Whenever the powers that be are forced to change or are thrown out of power, they talk about reconciliation and they talk about reapproachment. When the racists in South Africa had to concede power to the black majority, did Nelson Mandela and the ANC go after the people that murdered Stephen Biko, that murdered and tortured thousands and thousands of black Africans? Did any of these cops stand before a court of law and were judged on their actions? No. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee was established. You know, and then the guy that murdered Stephen Biko could come out and say, you know, I feel bad about this. I really, I just want you to know that, and the family sitting right there, the murdered man, I'm sorry, okay, see you later, you're sorry, let's move on. But when a black man stands up for the black community and defends the black community and is framed and put in jail like Mumia Abu Jamal, he can't make parole. It's the nature of the crime that's so heinous that he can't get out of jail. But here these dogs murdered and enslaved an entire nation of people, and not one of them went to jail. Not one. Not one. Why? Because truth and reconciliation only occurs when those in power are overthrown. And there's no retribution, because retribution means redistribution of wealth, and it means foremost the establishment of justice. Which brings me to my final point, Palestine. Justice. Justice. As long as there is a contradiction in history that does not provide justice for an oppressed people, it will never be resolved. Never. Every conflict that we see today in the world has its root in a history of injustice that was never addressed. Whether it's the Congo, whether it's Somalia, whether it's Kenya, whether it's the Yemen, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Darfur, these are all historical contradictions that were created by imperialist powers that were never addressed according to the principles of justice. That's why the people continue to fight. That's why the contradiction continues to exist. And in terms of Palestine, we see that the United States has carried out a policy to support a European settler state in an area and a region of a world that is geopolitically important to Western civilization. The idea and the notion of the Middle East is a complete fabrication and idea of the imperialist powers. Before World War I, the term Middle East was never used. The term Middle East, Far East, and Near East is a geopolitical construct of the imperialists. Almost every nation that you have in that region, almost every nation, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Lebanon, all of these states were created by who? The Europeans. The Europeans created every one of those states, And they created every one of those states in a struggle, in a conflict, in a historical moment. And that historical moment was the end of World War I and the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. They used divide and conquer. Both Turks and Arabs were Muslims, but the Turks were the administrators. So they used divide and conquer. At the same time that the imperial powers were using divide and conquer, mainly Britain and France, to overthrow the Ottoman Empire and open up the territory of what they called the Middle East to European penetration and dominance. From that point on, it was necessary to establish a military presence in that region, a supreme military presence. And that military presence is the Zionist state of Israel. That's why it's there. And this has been a dream of the Europeans ever since Columbus sailed west to go east. Ever since Mehmet took Constantinople and turned it into Istanbul. This has been an objective of the West ever since, to establish a permanent military presence and control in a vital region of this planet, the so-called Middle East. And that's the purpose and the existence that Israel serves. That's their existence, that's their purpose. Now, what does that have to do with us here? It has everything to do with us here because the United States subsidizes that entity to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a month. But they have no money for inner city urban schools. They have no money to put our children, give our children a decent education, to provide daycare for single mothers. They have no money for none of these things that benefit the American people, but they got money to bolster a racist state that has engaged in apartheid since its very existence. This money exists. And who allocates this money? The Ways and Means Committees, the Committees on Foreign Relations, and who sits on these committees? Black elected officials. Black congressmen, black senators. When there's an important bill that deals with Israel, it's I. When there's an important bill that deals with Israel that has no effect, it's nay. Like the Goldstone report. Look at the voting record of the Black Caucus on other issues that reflected on the Middle East and the war in the Middle East and the Afghan war. And you see that the majority of black elected officials voted yes in perpetuating those policies. But when it came to the Goldstone report, which had no effect whatsoever on anything, they all voted no. So they're trying to they'll tell me, don't tell me that I'm a pro-Zionist lobbyist because I'm infected by this because I voted no on the Goldstone report, but your vote didn't mean nothing. When it came to something that meant something, you either voted yes or you were absent. So what are you saying? We have black elected officials in our community that are more concerned with the existence of the state of Israel than they are with the black community that they represent. And how is that possible? Because of money. Because of money. The lobbyists provide funds and they provide moral sanctity to these politicians because they're not challenged by us. White people can't challenge these politicians. You can't even challenge your own. I mean, 80% of the people in the United States were opposed to the war in Iraq under the Bush administration, and the war continued. The war is still continuing to this day. The United States has been in Iraq longer than it was in World War II. And the guy that got elected to office to talk about he will go talk to anybody anywhere and do anything in order to bring about peace, who got a Nobel Peace Prize. This man got a Nobel Peace Prize just for being who he was. Because his whole speech, his acceptance speech was what? About just war. Have you ever heard a Nobel Peace Prize laureate talk about how war was just? Come on. Compare that to Martin Luther King. But then also realize that what was being done was legitimizing a historical moment. That's what the Nobel Peace Prize represented, the legitimization of a historical moment. Because who else won the Nobel Peace Prize? Menachem Begin. They couldn't give the Nobel Peace Prize to Sadat himself, so they included Menachem Begin because they said Sadat put out his hand and Menachem Begin shook it. So they both get the Peace Prize because Egypt was the first state to recognize Israel. And Menachem Begin took a bold move to do this, so he deserved the Nobel Peace Prize. They said the same thing about de Klerk in Mandela. De Klerk brought about the reconciliation of the white population in South Africa, so now you have a multiracial state, and for that, you understand, him and Mandela gets the Peace Prize. So now, Obama gets elected to office, talks smack about peace and world peace and justice, and he gets the Peace Prize and gives a speech about war. And everybody said, well, it's all cool, it's all good. You know, this was like a Nobel Peace Prize in advance of doing something. This was like a Nobel Peace Prize on credit. This was like a debit card Peace Prize. You know, if you ain't got no money in the bank, you can't get it. You know, they will embarrass your ass in the store. You understand? Sorry, sir, it's not authorized. So he's pre-Peace Prize. And then he turns right around and sends 50,000 troops to where? Afghanistan. Good Peace Prize. You know? That's like giving a Peace Prize to Attila the Hun. You know, you brought peace because you murdered everybody. And it's all quiet now. You see? And then he comes up with a policy talking about, well, you know, besides just wars, we have to understand that, you know, we can win this war. And I'm sending 50,000 troops to win this war because we know that we're having a new policy of engagement. In summation, I want to say that the historical moment that you're living in now, the legal system that we're struggling under now, the fight for our human and civil rights in this country are issues that we all need to engage ourselves in from wherever we're at, from academia, as students, as just ordinary people. We need to organize ourselves where we are at, in our community, around those issues that immediately affect our lives. This world has become a global community, but at the same time, it's become a global community because of technology. Increasingly, people are relying on close-knit networks in order to survive. So at the same time we're dealing with globalization, we're dealing with a contraction of our idea of community. Are we indeed our brothers and sisters' keeper? And if we are our brothers and sisters' keeper, who are our brothers and sisters that we keep? Just those that we know or those from afar? What happens in the courtrooms in America directly affects the United States' position legally in the world. What happens domestically in America with immigrant populations, with poor people, with women, with the marginalized, the criminalization of whole entire communities, the creation of an industry of prisons, all have reflected themselves in U.S. foreign policy. So before the United States commits injustices abroad, it first must commit those injustices against you. And you have to accept it as part of being American, as part of this American exceptionality. That, you know, America is the blessing of the planet. It's the light of the world. It's the light of humanity. And we all should be proud to be Americans, because we are all part of that light. You are part of the light only when you step on the stage. Other than that, you're in the shadows. So I'm going to encourage all of you to please participate in the programs to support political rights of political detainees and the rights of political prisoners. Stand up for what is right. You're not alone, and you won't be defeated. You'll only be defeated if you don't believe in your mission and if you don't believe in what you're doing. When I was in prison for 19 years, I was told that I would never get out of prison. Other prisoners used to say, damn, man, you think they're really going to let you out? And every year that I was in prison, I was getting out that year. Every year. The lawyer said, damn, ever since I met you, you were getting out of prison this year. Every year. Because I would not let them define my reality for me. And you cannot let these people that are leading this nation to hell define your reality for you. And that's my message. Stand up for what is right. Let there arise from amongst you a band of people who will enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. Thank you.